On the 25th of April 2006, Beaconsfield in Australia became the site of the worst mining collapse in the nation's history.
You talk about the darkness. People that have never been underground don't know what dark is.
On the 25th of April 2006, Anzac Day, the Beaconsfield gold mine experienced a catastrophic collapse, killing one miner and trapping two within the walls of the mine. Located on the island state of Tasmania, Australia, Beaconsfield was a former gold mining town, operating mines from as early as the 1850s. In the 1870s, gold was discovered in the mines of Beaconsfield, causing a gold rush. This gold brought miners from all over Tasmania and Greater Australia to Beaconsfield, making it the richest gold mining town in Tasmania. As the mines grew and more gold was being discovered, an English company bought out the land and mine, creating Tasmanian Gold Mining Company Limited. This acquisition brought new technologies and more labour to the mine, helping to discover and mine more gold. By 2005, a year before the collapse, the Beaconsfield mine extracted roughly 3,890 kilograms of gold, proving that it was still a lucrative mine even after years of digging and extraction. Now that we know a brief history of the mine, let's explore what happened on the day of the disaster.
Rodney Lowe's reporting there on just one of the many challenges being faced by the rescuers here at Beaconsfield.
On the Tuesday of April 25th, 2006, 17 gold miners set about their normal work day in the town of Beaconsfield, Tasmania. Work operations kicked off as per usual. However, no one could have expected that this day would mark one of Australia's most horrific mine collapses and lengthy rescue efforts. Shortly after 9 p.m, 3 employees, Todd Russell, Brant Webb, and Larry Knight, were working on the 925 metre level of the Beaconsfield mine. At approximately 9:23, a shallow depth earthquake with a 2.3 rating on the Richter scale shook the town of Beaconsfield. This seismic event could be felt deep inside the mine, shaking and moving the earth inside so much that it caused the mine to collapse in on itself.
That's really interesting because I was going to say, how do mines nowadays collapse? Because if you think like previously in years gone, there wouldn't have been the safety side of things. There wouldn't have been the technology to necessarily make these safe. But now, this was only in 2006. You would have thought, well, all the walls would have been properly supported, for example. But this was a case where actually it was an earthquake that then was felt inside the mine, and it just collapsed in on itself.
In this moment of brief chaos, 14 miners scrambled out the mines. However, Russell, Webb, and Knight weren't so fortunate. Larry Paul Knight of Launceston, Tasmania, was operating a telehandler with a metal cage attachment containing both Webb and Russell when the mine collapsed. He was sadly crushed by the falling rock at the time of the collapse. Webb and Russell, however, miraculously survived the collapse in the metal cage. It measured just 1.5 meters by 1.2 meters, leaving almost no room to move. With 800 tons of rock suspended directly overhead, the men lived every second in the mine with the possibility of another collapse. Following the earthquake, Russell had been partially buried by the rubble, his legs covered by the rock, immobilizing his lower half. Webb had been knocked unconscious, and when he awoke, the two miners began the process of freeing Russell from the fallen debris. Using a small lighter to illuminate the surroundings, the men were fully aware of the predicament that they were in. Trapped deep underground, with no way of communicating with the outside world, no fresh water, and only a granola bar between them, the situation looked very, very dire.
What an amazing, not an amazing, that's probably the wrong word, but an extraordinary situation to find yourself in. You are simply protected by the cage that you were in. The guy that was operating like the forklift machinery, obviously didn't have the same fate, and it was a lot worse for him. I would assume that the two that are in that cage, they would have thought that people would be coming to rescue them, surely, because what happens is in situations like this, you have the workers going in, the workers coming out. There should be records of who has gone in, and therefore you can get the records of who have come out. In this situation, 3 did not come out. So you would assume they would be looking for them. So in their heads, they must have thought, okay, well, hopefully rescue is going to come because they know we haven't come out. However, pretty deep, lots of rock, and rock is heavy. You see what it does. It traps people. It kills people. So for then the rescuers to try and remove those rocks is not easy. And therefore, it's a ticking time bomb once again on you've only got a certain amount of time to get these guys out before they run out of food. They'd have no water, which I assume they really didn't have apart from the granola bar. They didn't have food and water. So it's a time sensitive situation where, yes, they probably know people will know they're not out, but it must be so difficult to get them out in the first place. Harrowing. I couldn't imagine myself in that situation. I really, really couldn't.
With no way of knowing when or if they would be rescued, the miners had to find ways to survive the ordeal. The men utilised their work helmets as catchments for water that had dropped through the rocks overhead. However, this was barely adequate and obviously highly contaminated. Furthermore, they split a muesli bar which belonged to Webb, agreeing to wait as long as possible before consuming it. Eventually, stomachs growled and ached, and on the 29th of April, it was decided that they would eat their halves. For the first 5 days of their entrapment, Webb and Russell survived this way, rationing out their food and drinking dirty mine water. Russell had suffered significant injuries to his legs and was in need of medical attention, and Webb wasn't in much better shape, having been just concussed during the initial mine collapse. Meanwhile, 1 kilometre above where the men were trapped, rescue efforts were well underway. Rescuers began clearing rock using a remote-controlled earth mover, and on the morning of the 27th of April, an unfortunate discovery was made. It was the body of Larry Knight, who had been working on the same level as Webb and Russell. He had been crushed while operating the telehandler containing the 2 miners. He was just 44 years old. Rescue teams began using explosives to clear rock soon after the collapse of the mine, which proved to be a very effective method of excavation. However, each blast sent a fresh wave of rubble on the entrapped miners.
That's really interesting, isn't it? That they're using blasts to break up the rocks so they can clear it. The problem is, if they don't necessarily 100% know where the other 2 miners are, then you don't know where that blasted rock's going. You don't know what that blast is necessarily going to do. You can make an educated guess, but you can't say, okay, well, that's going to clear it and it will be safe around it. It's a dangerous job trying to rescue them by doing that. But it's probably the only method they've really got to try and get the rock out.
They never knew if the next explosion would be one to bring down all 800 tons of rock crashing down on them.
There you go.
To distract themselves during this time, Russell and Webb sang The Gambler by Kenny Rogers, which was the only song they both knew. On the evening of the 30th of April, after dozens of excavation attempts with the use of explosives, 2 rescuers named Pat Ball and Steve Saltmarsh entered the 925-metre level of the mine and called for the 2 trapped miners. The distant voices of Webb and Russell called back, confirming to the worried friends, relatives and nation at large that they were still alive.
I assume that was their wives. Can you imagine? Can you imagine how their wives must be feeling at that time? You know, not knowing if their husbands are alive or if they're dead. That you would be worried sick, a nervous wreck. And once again, yes, you feel so sorry for the 2 miners, but they know the situation they're in. It's almost for the wives, the uncertainty that must be the worst. The worst. Always thinking the worst. You know, are our husbands alive or dead? Horrible.
Soon after their discovery, the miners were sent food, water, clothes, and communication devices through a PVC pipe that had been placed through a drill hole. This channel led from the rescuer's position to the metal cage in which the men were trapped. Other supplies such as torches, matches, and cameras were sent through to the men, in addition to iPods containing music from an Australian musical comedian known as Kevin Bloody Wilson and the American rock band The Foo Fighters.
That's the way to cheer people
Drilling
up,
of the
right?
rescue tunnel
Kevin Bloody
began on the
Wilson.
4th of May. After a series of delays due to safety concerns, Matthew Gill, the operator of the Beaconsfield mine, claimed that the rock that had to be drilled through, composed of primarily quartz, was 5 times as strong as concrete. As a result, it took 6 days for drilling to be completed, and on the early morning of the 9th of May, the rescue tunnel was finished. Rescuers Donovan Lightfoot, Glenn Burns, and Royce Gill were the ones who broke through into the cage in which Webb and Russell were trapped. This occurred at 4:27 a.m. on the 9th of May, 2 weeks after the initial mine collapse.
Wow.
Brent Webb was the first to be freed at 4:47 a.m., followed by Todd Russell 7 minutes later. The miners were brought up through the tunnel and into a lift shaft, where they were then sent to the surface. At 5:58 a.m., in a very emotional scene, Russell and Webb exited the lift at the entrance to the mine, where they could be seen punching the air in celebration. After removing their tags, indicating the end of their shift, they were greeted by the elated family and friends. Both men received treatment at the local Launceston General Hospital shortly after 6 a.m. for injuries to both their vertebra and legs. Once the initial celebrations had ended, attention quickly turned to the circumstances of the collapse. An investigation by the Australian Workers' Union on the 15th of May 2006 found that of the miners present at the Beaconsfield Mine Collapse, not a single one had received adequate workplace hazard and safety training. Furthermore, materials used in the mine were found to be of poor quality or quantity, such as the cement, which had not been used properly to close sections of the mine. Additionally, it was widely known amongst the men that the mesh that was used to prevent rock collapse was not particularly effective. Ultimately, despite these shortfalls in the workplace safety measures, no charges were laid against any individual or company.
So are we saying that, yes, potentially these two men and the other one that died may not have had to suffer this because maybe the concrete wasn't good enough, maybe the mesh wasn't good enough, but ultimately, after the findings, maybe even after those things, it wouldn't have made any difference to the mine collapsing and causing this with the earthquake that happened. I don't know.
The physical recovery from their ordeal took Todd Russell and Brant Webb a relatively short amount of time. However, the psychological scars have not yet healed, even over 15 years later.
A lot of it is post-traumatic stress, and everybody around me could see the direction that I was taking, except for me. There was friends that were putting their hand out to offer the help, and I elected to do it my way. I thought I was coping with it the way I should have been coping with it, but I got a reality check when I came home and I was met at the front door by Carol and the 3 kids with their bags packed, ready for them to move out. Because, of the person I became after being stuck underground, it was a monster.
That's awful to hear, isn't it? It's the memories in their head. You close your eyes and that's the situation you see. I feel so sorry for them. And by the sounds of it, yes, they almost reached the brink, but he got help in the end.
Since the Beaconsfield mine collapse in 2006, over 40 accidents have occurred in Australia's mines, proving that the industry still has a long way to go in ensuring that all mine workers are safe. Thankfully, however, nothing has ever come close to the scale and notoriety of the Beaconsfield collapse in the years since, and hopefully this continues into the future.
Well, there is the Beaconsfield mine disaster, and I say at the end of all the other videos, well, hopefully they've learnt from it. Hopefully the companies and whatnot the people running these different places have learnt from the mistakes, and it doesn't happen again. But this is the first one that it sounds like actually possibly they haven't learnt. Maybe it's a case of the companies don't want to spend the money. And if you're trying to dig for gold, for example, there is plenty of money in it. You need to be making sure that your workplace is as safe as possible. Maybe that is not happening in the mining industry in Australia. A somewhat sad video. Real shame that one person lost their life, and then two, yes, they were saved, but then they have the mental scarring. I hope you enjoyed it, guys. Do you remember watching this on the news? Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll catch you next time.